Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat. That's me. Today we are reading Chapter 3 of Pawn of Prophecy, and as always, you should support the original work by buying the book if you can. Chapter 3. Some few mornings later, when Aunt Poll had begun to scowl at his continued lurking in her kitchen, the old man made excuse of some errand to the nearby village of Upper Gralt. "Good," Aunt Poll said somewhat ungraciously. "At least my pantries will be safe while you're gone." He bowed mockingly, his eyes twinkling. "Do you need anything, Mistress Poll?" he asked. "Some trifling thing I might purchase for you, as long as I'm going anyway." Aunt Poll thought a moment. "Some of my spice parts are a bit low," she said, "and there's a Tulnedran spice merchant in Fennel Lane just south of the town tavern. I'm sure you'll have no trouble finding the tavern." "The trip's likely to be dry," the old man admitted pleasantly, "and lonely, too. 10 leagues with no one to talk to is a long way." "Talk to the birds," Aunt Poll suggested bluntly. "Birds listen well enough," the old man said, "but their speech is repetitious and quickly grows tiresome. Why don't I take the boy along for company?" Garion held his breath. "He's picking up enough bad habits on his own," Aunt Poll said tartly. "I'd prefer his not having expert instruction." "Why, Mistress Poll," the old man objected, stealing a ruler almost absently, "you'd do me an injustice. Besides, a change will do the boy good. Broaden his horizons, you might say." "His horizons are quite broad enough, thank you," she said. Garion's heart sank. "Still," she continued, "at least I can count on him not to forget my spices altogether, or to become so fuddled with ale that he infuses peppercorns with cloves or cinnamon with nutmeg. Very well, take the boy along, but mind, I don't want you taking him into any low or disreputable places." "Mistress Poll," the old man said, feigning shock, "would I frequent such places?" "I know you too well, old wolf," she said dryly. "You take to vice and corruption as naturally as a duck takes to a pond. If I hear that you've taken the boy into any unsavory place, you and I will have words." "Then I'll have to make sure that you don't hear of anything like that, won't I?" Aunt Poll gave him a hard look. "I'll see which spices I need," she said. "And I'll borrow a horse and cart from Falder," the old man said, stealing another cruller. In a surprisingly short time, Garion and the old man were bouncing along the rutted road to Upper Gralt, behind a fast-trotting horse. It was a bright summer morning, and there were a few dandelion puff clouds in the sky and deep blue shadows under the hedgerows. After a few hours, however, the sun became hot, and the jolting ride became tiresome. "Are we almost there?" Garion asked for the third time. "Not for some time yet," the old man said. 10 leagues is a goodly distance." "I was there once before," Garion told him, trying to sound casual. "Of course, I was only a child at the time, so I don't remember too much about it. It seemed to be quite a fine place." The old man shrugged. "It's a village," he said, "much like any other." He seemed a bit preoccupied. Garion, hoping to nudge the old man into a story to make the miles go faster, began asking questions. "Why is it that you don't have a name, if I'm not being impolite in asking?" "I have many names," the old man said, scratching his white beard. "Almost as many names as I have years." "I've only got one," Garion said. "So far." "What?" "You only have one name so far," the old man explained. "In time you may get another, or even several. Some people collect names as they go along through their lives. Sometimes names wear out, just like clothes." "Aunt Poll calls you Old Wolf," Garion said. "I know," the old man said. "Aunt Poll and I have known each other for a very long time. Why does she call you that? Who can say why a woman such as your aunt does anything?" "May I call you Mr. Wolf?" Garion asked. Names were quite important to Garion, and the fact that the old storyteller did not seem to have one always bothered him.
The namelessness had made the old man seem somehow incomplete, unfinished. The old man looked at him soberly for a moment, and then he burst out laughing. "Mr. Wolf, indeed! How very appropriate! I think I like that name better than any I've had in years." "May I, then?" Garion asked. "Call you Mr. Wolf, I mean? I think I'd like that, Garion. I think I'd like that very much." "Now would you please tell me a story, Mr. Wolf?" Garion asked. The time and distance went by much faster then, as Mr. Wolf wove for Garion tales of glorious adventure and dark treachery, taken from those gloomy, unending centuries of the horrendous civil wars. "Why are the errands like that?" Garion asked, after a particularly grim tale. "The errands are very noble," Wolf said, lounging back in the seat of the cart with the reins held negligently in one hand. "Nobility is a trait that's not always trustworthy, since it sometimes causes men to do things for obscure reasons." "Rendering's an errand," Garion said. "He sometimes seems to be, well, not too quick of thought, if you know what I mean." "It's the effect of all that nobility," Wolf said. "Errands spend too much time concentrating on being noble that they don't have time to think of other things." They came over to the crest of a long hill, and there in the next valley lay the village of Upper Gralt. To Garion, the tiny cluster of gray stone houses with slate roofs seemed disappointingly small. Two roads, white with thick dust, intersected there, and there were a few narrow winding streets besides. The houses were square and solid, but seemed almost like toys set down in the valley below. The horizon beyond was ragged with the mountains of eastern Sandaria, and though it was summer, the tops of most of the mountains were still wrapped in snow. Their tired horse plodded down the hill toward the village, his hooves stirring little clouds of dust with each step, and soon they were clattering along the cobblestone streets toward the center of the village. The villagers, of course, were all too important to pay any attention to an old man and a small boy in a farm cart. The women wore gowns and high-pointed hats, and the men wore doublets and soft velvet caps. Their expressions seemed haughty, and they looked with obvious disdain at the few farmers in town who respectfully stood aside to let them pass. "They're very fine, aren't they?" Garion observed. "They seem to think so," Wolf said, his expression faintly amused. "I think it's time we found something to eat, don't you?" Though he had not realized it until the old man mentioned it, Garion was suddenly ravenous. "Where can we go?" he asked. "They all seem so splendid. Would any of them let strangers sit at their tables?" Wolf laughed and shook a jingling purse at his waist. "We shouldn't have any trouble making acquaintances," he said. "There are places where one can buy food." Buy food? Garion had never heard of such a thing before. Anyone who appeared at Falder's gate at mealtime was invited to the table as a matter of course. The world of the villagers was obviously very different from the world of Falder's farm. "But I don't have any money," he objected. "I've got enough for us both," Wolf assured him, stopping their horse before a large, low building with a sign bearing a picture of a cluster of grapes hanging just above the door. There were words on the sign, but of course Garion could not read them. "What do the words say, Mr. Wolf?" he asked. "They say that food and drink can be bought inside," Wolf told him, getting down from the cart. "It must be a fine thing to be able to read," Garion said wistfully. The old man looked at him, seemingly surprised. "You can't read, boy?" he asked incredulously. "I've never found anyone to teach me," Garion said. "Falder reads, I think, but no one else at the farm knows how." "Nonsense," Wolf snorted. "I'll speak to your aunt about it. She's been neglecting her responsibility. She should have taught you years ago." "Can Aunt Paul read?" Garion asked, stunned. "Of course she can," Wolf said, leading the way into the tavern. "She says she finds little advantage in it, but she and I had that particular argument out many years ago." The old man seemed quite upset by Garion's lack of education. Garion, however, was far too interested in the smoky interior of the tavern to pay much attention. The room was large and dark with a low-beamed ceiling and a stone floor strewn with rushes. Though it was not cold, a fire burned in the stone pit in the center of the room, and the smoke rose errantly toward a chimney set above it on 4 square stone pillars. Tallow candles guttered in clay dishes on several of the long tables, and there was a reek of wine and stale beer in the air. "What have you to eat?" Wolf demanded of a sour, unshaven man wearing a grease-sported apron. "We've a bit of joint left," the man said, pointing at a spit resting to one side of the fire pit. "Roasted only a day before yesterday, and meat porridge fresh yesterday morning, and bread no more than a week old." "Very well," Wolf said, sitting down, "and I'll have a pot of your best ale and milk for the boy." "Milk?" Garion protested. "Milk," Wolf said firmly. "You have money?" the sour-looking man demanded. Wolf jingled his purse, and the sour man looked suddenly less sour. "Why is that man over there sleeping?" Garion asked, pointing at a snoring villager sitting with his head down on one of the tables. "Drunk," Wolf said, scarcely glancing at the snoring man. "Shouldn't someone take care of him?" "He'd rather not be taken care of." "Do you know him?" "I know of him," Wolf said, "and many others like him. I've occasionally been in that condition myself." "Why?" "It seemed appropriate at the time." The roast was dry and overdone. The meat porridge was thin and watery, and the bread was stale, but Garion was too hungry to notice. He carefully cleaned his plate as he had been taught, then sat as Mr. Wolf lingered over a second pot of ale. "Quite splendid," he said, more to be saying something than out of any real conviction. All in all, he found the upper Gralt did not live up to his expectations. "Adequate," Wolf shrugged. "Village taverns are much the same the world over. I've seldom seen one I'd hurry to revisit. Shall we go?" He laid down a few coins, which the sour-looking man snatched up quickly, and led Garion back out into the afternoon sunlight. "Let's find your aunt's spice merchant," he said, "and then see to a night's lodging, and a stable for our horse." They set off down the street, leaving horse and cart beside the tavern. The house of the Talnedran spice merchant was a tall, narrow building in the next street. 2 swarthy, thick-bodied men in short tunics lounged in the street at his front door near a fierce-looking black horse wearing a curious armored saddle. The 2 men stared with dull-eyed disinterest at passers-by in the lane. Mr. Wolf stopped when he caught sight of them. "Is something wrong?" Garion asked. "Thulls," Wolf said quietly, looking hard at the 2 men. "What?" "Those 2 are thulls," the old man said. "They usually work as porters for the Murgos." "What are Murgos?" "The people of Cathal Murgos," Wolf said shortly. "Southern Angarax." "The ones we beat in the Battle of O'Mimber?" Garion asked. "Why would they be here?" "The Murgos have taken up commerce," Wolf said, frowning. "I hadn't expected to see one of them in so remote a village. We may as well go in. The Thulls have seen us, and it might look strange if we turned now and went back. Stay close to me, boy, and don't say anything." They walked past the 2 heavy-set men and entered the spice merchant's shop. The Talnedran was a thin, bald-headed man wearing a brown belted gown that reached to the floor. He was nervously weighing several packets of pungent-smelling powder which lay on the counter before him. "Good day to you," he said to Wolf. "Please have patience. I'll be with you shortly." He spoke with a slight lisp that Garion found peculiar. "No hurry," Wolf said in a wheezy, dry, cracking voice. Garion looked at him sharply and was astonished to see that his friend was stooped and that his head was nodding foolishly. "See to their needs," the other man in the shop said shortly. He was a dark, burly man wearing a chain shirt and a short sword belted to his waist. His cheekbones were high, and there were several savage-looking scars on his face. His eyes looked curiously angular, and his voice was harsh and thickly accented. "No hurry," Wolf said in his wheezy cackle. "My business here will take some time," the Murgos said coldly, "and I'd prefer not to be rushed. Tell the merchant here what you need, old man." "My thanks, then," Wolf cackled. I have a list somewhere about me." He began to fumble foolishly in his pockets. "My master drew it up. I do hope you can read it, friend merchant, for I cannot." He finally found the list and presented it to the Talnidran. The merchant glanced at the list. "This'll only take a moment," he told the Murgo. The Murgo nodded and stood staring stonily at Wolf and Garion. His eyes narrowed slightly and his expression changed. "You're a seemly appearing boy," he said to Garion. "What's your name?" Until that moment in his entire life, Garion had been so honest and truthful boy, but Wolf's manner had opened before his eyes an entire world of deception and subterfuge. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he seemed to hear a warning voice, a dry, calm voice advising him that the situation was dangerous and that he should take steps to protect himself. He hesitated only an instant before telling his first deliberate lie. He allowed his mouth to drop open and his face to assume an expression of vacant-headed stupidity. "Runderig, your honor," he mumbled. "An Arendish name," the Murgo said, his eyes narrowing even more. "You don't look like an errand." Garion gaped at him. "Are you an errander, Underig?" the Murgo pressed. Garion frowned as if struggling with a thought while his mind raced. The dry voice suggested several alternatives. "My father was," he said finally, "but my mother's a centaur, and people say I favor her." "You say was," the Murgo said quickly. "Is your father dead, then?" His scarred face was intent. Garion nodded foolishly. "A tree he was cutting fell on him," he lied. "It was a long time ago." The Murgo suddenly seemed to lose interest. "Here's a copper penny for you, boy," he said indifferently, tossing a small coin on the floor at Garion's feet. "It has the likeness of the god Torak stamped on it. Perhaps it will bring you luck, or at least more weight." Wolf stooped quickly and retrieved the coin, but the coin he handed to Garion was a common Sendarian penny. "Thank the good man, Runderig," he wheezed. "My thanks, your honor," Garion said, concealing the penny tightly in his fist. The Murgo shrugged and looked away. Wolf paid the Talnidran merchant for the spices, and he and Garion left the shop. "You played a dangerous game, boy," Wolf said once they were out of earshot of the two lounging thulls. "You seemed not to want him to know who we were," Garion explained. "I wasn't sure why, but I thought I ought to do the same." "Was what I did wrong?" "You're very quick," Wolf said approvingly. "I think we managed to deceive the Murgo." "Why did you change the coin?" Garion asked. "Sometimes Angarak coins aren't what they seem," Wolf said. "It's better for you not to have any of them. Let's fetch our horse and cart. It's a long way back to Falder's farm." "I thought we were going to take lodgings for the night." "That's changed now. Come along, boy. It's time for us to leave." The horse was very tired, and he moved slowly up the long hill out of Upper Gralt as the sun went down ahead of them. "Why wouldn't you let me keep the Angarak penny, Mr. Wolf?" Garion persisted. The subject still puzzled him. "There are many things in this world that seem to be one thing, but are in fact another," Wolf said somewhat grimly. "I don't trust Angaraks, and I particularly don't trust Murgos. It'd be just as well, I think, if you never had anything in your possession that bears the likeness of Torak." "But the war between the West and the Angaraks has been over for 500 years now," Garion objected. "All men say so." "Not all men," Wolf said. "Now take that robe out of the back of the cart and cover up. Your aunt would never forgive me if I let you take a chill." "I will if you think I should," Garion said, "but I'm not a bit cold and not at all sleepy. I'll keep you company as we go." "That'll be a comfort, boy," Wolf said. "Mr. Wolf, Garion said after some time. "Did you know my mother and father?" "Yes," Wolf said quietly. "My father's dead too, isn't he?" "I'm afraid so." Garion sighed deeply. "I thought so," he said. "I wish I'd known them. Aunt Paul says I was only a baby when he couldn't bring himself to say it. I've tried to remember my mother, but I can't." "You were very small," Wolf said. "What were they like?" Garion asked. Wolf scratched at his beard. "Ordinary," he said. "So ordinary you wouldn't look twice at either of one of them." Garion was offended by that. "Aunt Paul says my mother was very beautiful," he objected. "She was." "Then how can you say she was ordinary?" "She wasn't prominent or important," Wolf said. "Neither was your father. Anyone who saw them thought that they were just simple village people, a young man with a young wife and their baby. That's all anyone ever saw. That's all anyone was ever supposed to see." "I don't understand." "It's very complicated." "What was my father like?" "Medium size," Wolf said. "Dark hair, very serious young man. I liked him." "Did he love my mother?" "More than anything." "And me?" "Of course." "What kind of place did they live in?" "It was a small place," Wolf said. "A little village near the mountains, a long way from any main roads. They had a cottage at the end of the street. It was a small, solid little house. Your father built it himself. He was a stone cutter. I used to stop by there once in a while when I was in the neighborhood." The old man's voice droned on, describing the village and the house that the two had lived there. Garion listened, not even realizing it when he fell asleep. It must have been very late, almost on toward dawn. In a half-drowse, the boy felt himself lifted from the cart and carried up a flight of stairs. The old man was surprisingly strong. Aunt Paul was there. He knew that without even opening his eyes. There was a particular scent about her that he could have found in a dark room. "Just cover him up," Mr. Wolf said softly to Aunt Paul. "Best not to wake him just now." "What happened?" Aunt Paul asked, her voice as soft as the old man's. "There was a Murgo in town, at your spice merchant. He asked questions, and he tried to give the boy an Angarak penny." "In Upper Gralt? Are you certain he was only a Murgo?" "It's impossible to tell. Not even I can distinguish between Murgo and Gralum with any certainty." "What happened to the coin?" "I was quick enough to get it. I gave the boy a Sendarian penny instead. If our Murgo was a Gralum, we'll let him follow me. I'm sure I can give him several months of entertainment." "You'll be leaving then?" Aunt Paul's voice seemed somehow sad. "It's time," Wolf said. "Right now the boy is safe enough here, and I must be abroad. There are things afoot I must see to. When Murgos begin to appear in remote places, I begin to worry. We have a great responsibility and a great care placed upon us, and we mustn't allow ourselves to become careless." "Will you be gone long?" Aunt Paul asked. "Some years, I expect. There are many things I must look into, and many people I'll have to see." "I'll miss you," Aunt Paul said softly. He laughed. "Sentimentality, Paul?" he said dryly. "That's hardly in character." "You know what I mean. I'm not suited for this task you and the others have given me. What do I know about raising up small boys?" "You're doing well," Wolf said. "Keep the boy close, and don't let his nature drive you into hysterics. Be careful. He lies like a champion." "Garion?" Her voice was shocked. "He lied to the Murgos so well that even I was impressed." "Garion?" "He's also started asking questions about his parents," Wolf said. "How much have you told him?" "Very little, only that they're dead." "Let's leave it at that for now. There's no point in telling him things he isn't old enough to cope with yet." Their voices went on, but Garion drifted off into sleep again, and he was almost sure that it was all a dream. But the next morning when he awoke, Mr. Wolf was gone.